I'm here with Jennifer Holberg, professor of English at Calvin College and co-director of Calvin's new Center for Faith and Writing. Thank you, Jennifer, for joining us today.
Thank you.
As you know, Frederick Buechner will soon be turning 90 years old. Is there anything you would like to wish him for this great milestone?
I'd just like to wish him every joy and send great gratitude for a life well lived. That verse, perhaps it's a cliche, but in Fred's case, I think so well deserved. Well done, good and faithful servant. I love that verse in the Psalms that talks about one generation will tell of your mighty acts to another. And I just really am so appreciative of the ways in which Fred's whole life and his work together in all ways testify to those mighty acts. But ironically, that the mighty acts are often the smallest acts. And so thank you for a life that has asked me to pay attention to my own life and the ways in which my life needs to speak into other people's. So thank you for your generosity as well.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I'm sure Mr. Buechner will greatly appreciate hearing from you. Next, can you tell me how you first learned about Frederick Buechner?
Well, I came to teach at Calvin College in 1998, and when I came, I had vaguely heard of Fred's work, but I had the great good pleasure to meet Dale Brown, who had written his dissertation on Buechner and had also made Fred's work his life's work. And so through Dale, I asked Dale what I should read, and I began what has become then a lifelong reading project in Buechner's works, in Buechner's thinking, and I've had the delight of getting to hear Fred live and talk with him and get to know him. So it's really through Dale, which is I'm sure true for many people, that I got to know Fred's life and work, and Fred himself.
What most attracts you to Mr. Buechner's writing?
Well, I love there are many things, but I would say first of all the authenticity, the call to live into the complicated life that you actually live. I think all of Fred's work are sort of jewel-like in the sense that they're not only beautiful, but they ask us to look at things through different facets. They ask us to sort of see the world anew through different perspectives, through different people's stories, and to really continue to examine our own stories again and again to understand where God is at work. I love the plenitude that Fred's work offers. I think it asks us to have such a generosity of spirit towards ourself. I mean, there's that wonderful Hopkins poem where he says, "My own self, let me more have pity on." And I don't think it's any surprise that Fred has written on Hopkins in Speak What We Feel, because he's the sort of writer that really, I think, captures what Fred's own work is about, a kind of generosity towards ourselves, a generosity towards other people, seeing a God that's quite generous and is seeking us out and loves us and is full of grace. Fred is a very grace-filled writer, where he wants us to understand all of the ways in which our failures are not the last word. Those wonderful lines of his, that death is not the last word, but only the second to the last. And I like that he calls us to what I think Denise Levertov, to what Jane Kenyon called the luminous particular. He's very insistent on that tap on the window from the tree or the clock in the hall, to pay attention to sort of not just these ginormous things, these big things, but that the most important things are often the small things that are happening all around us that we are too busy, too distracted to notice. So I appreciate his call to attention. And then I think finally, we often, especially probably Christians maybe, spend a lot of time thinking about Fred's the kind of lessons that he teaches and the kind of moral example that his books set, although that sounds a little drippy. but I would say we also need, what also attracts me is that he's an incredibly good writer. His technical mastery in each of his books is really impressive, and I think often unremarked upon because it's so good. I remember when I was first told that Godric was written in iambic pentameter. I teach English every day, and that's not something I had noticed. And the very fact that I hadn't noticed, I think, is testimony to the degree of to the degree that this is just an incredibly well-crafted piece of work. So I appreciate the sort of things I learned from Fred, but I also appreciate that he says them in ways that are just so winsome and beautiful.
So how would you say Fred's writing has influenced your own career?
Well, I think that for one thing, it has made me more interested in new and better models of testimony. I think many of us grow up in situations in church where it feels like there's maybe one or two stories that are available to us. And I think Fred's insistence that we each tell our stories, that each story is important, that all of us need to add our picture into the photo album that is the cloud of witnesses. I think that's really important, not just for me personally and thinking about my own story, but in terms of working with students and community folks and saying all of your stories matter too. As we move into an era where the humanities maybe seem to be disappearing, I think that the insistence of Fred's work is to say, no, story is the most important thing that we have. It's the most important thing that the church has. And we need to be listening and rethinking about the stories of the church. And so that's why I think retellings like Son of Laughter for biblical characters, for Godric or Brendan as we think about what it means to be a saint, for Fred's own stories about his life and what it means to be a contemporary 20th century, 21st century human being. All of those stories sort of enrich, I think, our understanding of what it means to be human and what it means to be Christian. And that, I think, is really attractive because we live in a culture that wants to present us with one narrative or flatten out the narratives that we have. And I think his work continually pushes against that and says, no, complexity, diversity, let's all think and rethink about things we think we know. We think we know about our own stories. We think we know about the stories of the Bible. But let's look at those again and try to understand what other riches are there for us, because these stories are, as I said earlier, he's a writer of great plenitude, and he is trying to bring us to a sense of the great, I think, the great extravagance of the world, and that's a gift in a time when we often feel like we're lacking and that things are disappearing. And I think it's a great joy then to sort of understand the richness of our stories.
You've mentioned several of Buechner's books. Which would you say has been best to you?
Well, it's really, that's sort of, asking which of your friends do you like the best. I think that each of them have been important in different ways. So I'd say The Sacred Journey is the first one I read. So I have a certain nostalgia for it just because it was the first one, and I think it's so important in beginning to hear that wonderful, kind voice coming out to you and saying, listen to my story, listen to what's happened to me, and I'm so interested in knowing yours, inviting you into this world of the memoirs. I think for many people that's probably how they come to Fred, and I think they're a wonderful way to do that. For me too, I've really appreciated his work in literature, so I've taught for many years telling the truth. And I really feel that it's call for us to think about all the different parts of the story and how important each of those parts are, so that we can't have the comedy without the tragedy, but that neither of those are the ending point, that really we live in this fantastical story of fairy tale. Who would think that there's a God who would come and rescue us? And so that book has been important in having a really handy way to talk about the complexity of the Christian story. And I'm very fond of Speak What We Feel, partly because we share a love of similar authors, and I always love to get to be in conversation through a book with someone who also loves Gerard Manley Hopkins and folks like that. And then, of course, Godric, which I also taught. Part of that is that I taught it with my dear colleague Dale, but I think it's just such a challenging book in terms of thinking about sainthood. And what does it mean to be a saint? And how do we tell our lives? And what is our tendencies as Christians to want to make everything look beautiful? And yet the reality of the story, which Godric highlights, is that despite the brokenness, we're beautiful. Not because the story is beautiful, are we beautiful. So I think those are sort of four of them that would be important to me. Yeah.
More broadly speaking, what influence would you say Mr. Buechner has had on Christianity and the world at large?
Well, I think he's tried to help us be kinder to ourselves. I think when I look on the internet now and I see Facebook memes or things on Twitter, it's often his reminders about being full of grace towards ourselves and towards each other. And I think in a world that is always championing perfection and wanting us to be excellent and things like that, it's really wonderful to have someone who continues to say to us, you're good enough already. God loves you enough already. God is reaching out to you already. So I think in his real insistence on grace, that's incredibly important. But I also think that his insistence on story and having us tell stories and understand our stories, that I think he will continue to be for centuries one of the more important Christian thinkers from our time period, because he really gives us a way to do memoir well. Memoir is sort of one of the big genres of our time, but there are so many bad ones. There are so many wannabe Buechners. And I think that's fine. I think that there's a way in which that's almost a compliment that so many people have been encouraged to tell their story. But I think as we look back to what survives, as we continue to have a kind of canon of Christian literature or of Christian thinking, that Buechner is very important because he does it the best. He helps us, he gives us models. So if you read The Sacred Journey, I have a model to think about how I might tell my story. It's not the only model, and I think he himself would probably resist the idea that I would write it in the same way, but that I would try to live authentically. And I think that's the final thing. He talks in his memoirs about very hard things in his family, his father's suicide, his daughter's illness, his own struggles. But he does it in a way that has such class and such beauty. It's not easy. It's not sensational. And I think we need as much of that as possible as we continue to think about what should these stories look like? How do we best testify to those mighty acts? How do we say one generation to another? And so I think that he provides both in terms of the quality of his writing, but also the nature of his writing, and then the authenticity of his own life. Just a really wonderful model for the church. And I guess the other thing is he makes it so that it's not antithetical to be a creative person and a person of belief. That being a writer, Flannery O'Connor struggled with this. Various other writers have tried to figure out, how am I a faithful Christian and yet faithful to my writing? How does one not trump the other? How do I not tell easy stories of faith? Or how do I tell stories that maybe are literarily good but that don't have much truth in them? And I think he's one writer that really does that well. Yeah. Grace-filled, authentic, generous of spirit, a caller of attention to beauty, and a caller of someone who, I mean, he really is an encourager. And that's not really a rich enough term, but he really wants, I think, to encourage us to understand, again, how much God loves us, how much we're enough, how much our stories count. So, yes, encourager, and just really a lovely man. Words, it's the problem with describing someone like Frederick Buechner is he's so wonderful with words that your own words always fall short. So I think as we grasp towards something, towards the inarticulate, I think all we can offer are things like thank you and we love you, which are never enough, but at least I think Fred encourages us to say them. And I guess that would be the other thing that I think is really important about his life is his encouragement to, as that book title says, speak what we feel, to not keep it hidden, to not bottle up our stories. So